Hello, IB Bio students. Today we are going to continue with 8.2, and 8.2 pretty much talks about cellular respiration. So we're going to break down cellular respiration into different core content. So first, it's important for us to understand the energy conversions, what happens to ATP as it's being transferred in a redox reaction. And then we're going to be looking at 5 stages of cellular respiration, which is glycolysis, the link reaction, the Krebs cycle, the electron transfer chain, and chemiosmosis, which is not listed here, but it's part of the electron transfer chain. And then we're going to look at the structure of the mitochondria and the aerobic overview of all of these stages. Okay, so let's begin. So the first understanding here is phosphorylation. So we have to understand what phosphorylation means. And phosphorylation is when you take a molecule and you make it less stable by adding an additional phosphate group. So here we see how ATP gets phosphorylated. So adenosine triphosphate, we know, is the ATP molecule, and it's a high energy molecule, and it contains all of its power or all of its energy in these high energy bonds between the phosphate groups. So we see, let's look at the ATP molecule a little bit more careful. We see that it's made up of adenine, made up of ribose, and hence the name adenosine. And then we see that it's made up of 3 phosphate groups, and hence the name triphosphate. Now, these phosphate groups are covalently bonded, so that means that they store potential energy in their bonds. So anytime you phosphorylate a molecule, or meaning you add an additional phosphate group to the molecule, you make the molecule less stable. So then that means that the ATP molecule is just ready to react. And it contains all that energy, and then it can just explode into an energy release. Now, what happens when ATP is hydrolyzed? So when ATP is hydrolyzed, that means that it loses an inorganic phosphate. So think of ATP as being a full battery, and ADP, it's a battery that doesn't have that much power, but that can potentially be recharged. So ADP is a rechargeable battery. So here we see when ADP gets phosphorylated, when ADP gets hydrolyzed, it loses an inorganic phosphate group, and the energy gets released when that terminal phosphate bond is broken apart. So here you see the energy release right here. Okay, so that's the relationship between ATP and ADP. Now, what is the key function of ATP? So ATP has 2 key functions. It functions as the energy currency of the cell by releasing energy when hydrolyzed to ADP. But it may also transfer the released phosphate group to other organic molecules, rendering them less stable and more reactive. So this is something that ATP can do, but we're going to focus more on this function right here today. Now, ATP is synthesized from ADP. That means that if we look at this diagram here, it can also go the other way, right? So ADP can become a recharged battery again, and it can do so via 2 sources. So here we see that the energy derived to synthesize ATP again is through solar energy. So in photosynthesis, we see this happening. We see light energy converting into chemical energy, and we see the chemical energy stored as ATP. And through an oxidative process, and this is what we're going to focus in 8.2, is in this oxidative process known as cellular respiration. So that means that organisms that undergo cellular respiration cannot take that solar energy and convert it into chemical energy. So they actually have to eat, and so heterotrophs have to eat, and they have to take that organic molecule known as food or glucose, and through the process of cellular respiration, they release chemical energy that is stored as ATP. So we know that as an oxidative process. All right, continuing. So the essential understanding here is that cell respiration involves the oxidation and reduction of electron carriers. So this essential understanding is packed with information. So we first have to understand what oxidation is, what reduction is, and what electron carriers are. So there's a lot of information there. So we're going to break that apart in just a moment. So in looking at cellular respiration, we know that cellular respiration is the controlled release of energy. So you learned back in 9th grade that you take the glucose from the food sources that you eat, and that per one glucose molecule, you end up producing about 36 molecules of ATP. Now, respiration can happen without oxygen, and we call that anaerobic respiration. And in this case, we get an incomplete breakdown of the organic molecules. And since no oxygen is required, we only end up with a small yield of ATP. So for example, processes like fermentation, which is not part of cellular respiration, but processes like fermentation is an anaerobic process. But also within cellular respiration, we see that glycolysis is an anaerobic process, and it's only going to yield about 2 molecules of ATP, so very little ATP there. But if oxygen is involved, then we call it aerobic respiration. Therefore, oxygen is required. We get a complete breakdown of the organic molecules, and then we get a larger yield of ATP. So then we're going to see how the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain via chemiosmosis, they're going to yield a large amount of ATP. And we're going to see a little bit more of that in the breakdown later on. So now let's move on a little bit further. And there's a lot of information in this section. So here we see that when you break down an organic molecule like sugar, you can do so in 2 ways, right? You can do so through direct combustion, or you can do it through cellular respiration. Now, if I take sugar, for example, as a reactant and I burn it, then that is going to require a significant input of heat or a significant input of energy. So I require a large activation energy. And then when I burn that sugar, I'm going to get some sort of an explosion. Maybe not a very drastic explosion, but an explosion in the sense that the energy is lost as heat. So we get an uncontrolled release of heat. Eventually, I'm going to end up with my products that are carbon dioxide and water. Now, combustion of sugars can definitely happen, but in cellular respiration, the sugar is not combusted, right? Because again, this is happening in our bodies. This is happening within our cells, so we can't just burn the glucose in our cells. So our bodies have devised a more efficient method through the oxidation of sugar. And this is what we refer to as cellular respiration. So instead of just requiring a lot of activation energy to start the process, we kind of stagger the breakdown of the glucose molecule, as you see here in many steps. So then that means that instead of requiring a very large activation energy, we require small activation energies that can be reached at normal core body temperatures. So a small activation energy here and here and here and here versus a very large one. So then that means that you end up with a controlled release of energy. And then that energy that is being released right here and here and here and here and here, that energy is not getting lost as it would here. That energy is actually going to get picked up and it's going to get transferred and it's going to get picked up and be transferred through these carrier molecules that we're going to learn about in just a sec. And then you take that energy and you use it to synthesize the ATP, or the energy that you need in your body. Now, the side products are still carbon dioxide and water, and we know that those are the end products of cellular respiration. So, to recap here, cellular respiration is a controlled breakdown of organic molecules over many steps, as you see here. That energy that is being released along those many steps gets captured via redox reactions, and then that energy gets transferred, not just captured, but also transferred via carrier molecules to generate ATP for your body to do work, to be able to sit here and listen to me talk. All right, so let's understand what a redox reaction is. Redox stands for reduction oxidation. So we know that redox reactions are the mechanism by which chemical energy is transferred when organic molecules are broken down by cellular respiration. So most redox reactions either involve the transfer of electrons, hydrogen, or oxygen. So this is very important right here. So there's 3 players involved in redox reaction: electrons, hydrogen, and oxygen. So you probably learned some of this in chemistry, perhaps in physics, right? That reduction means that you are going to gain electrons or hydrogens, and that you're going to lose oxygen. And oxidation means that you're going to lose electrons and hydrogen, and you're going to gain oxygen. So notice that whatever the electrons do, the hydrogen does as well. And that tends to be the opposite of what happens to the oxygen. So here they give you a nice little table to summarize the oxidation reduction reactions. So here we see a reducing agent that is losing electrons and losing hydrogens. So this reducing agent is getting oxidized. And then this oxidizing agent here, it's getting reduced when it gains these electrons, this hydrogen, and when it loses the oxygen. So there are a couple of nice little mnemonics to help you remember the redox reactions. I learned the oil rig. So oxidation is loss of electrons and reduction is gain of electrons. But you can also remember Leo goes grrr, which is loss of electrons is oxidation and gain of electrons is reduction. Or you can just remember ELMO, and ELMO stands for electron loss means oxidation. Because sometimes it's a little difficult to keep all of these processes here straight in your head. All right, so let's look at the next essential understanding. And this says that energy released by oxidation reactions is carried. So now we know how energy can be released, right? It can be released through a series of steps through the cellular respiration process. But then this energy that gets released needs to be carried, and it needs to be carried to the cristae of the mitochondria. And if you remember the cristae of the mitochondria, if we draw a mitochondria here carefully, the cristae is just that inner membrane of the mitochondria, right? So that's what the cristae is. So energy released by oxidation reactions is carried to the cristae of the mitochondria by reduced NAD and FAD, or NAD and FAD. So what are these NAD and FAD? We're going to see this in just a moment. So a little recap of what we've learned so far. Cellular respiration breaks down organic molecules like sugar and transfers hydrogen atoms and electrons to carrier molecules. As the organic molecule is losing hydrogen atoms and electrons, we say that this is an oxidation reaction, OIL. And energy stored in the organic molecule is transferred with the protons and electrons to the carrier molecules. And these are the carrier molecules that we are going to explore just now. So these carrier molecules are called hydrogen carriers, but they can also be called electron carriers as they gain electrons, but they can also gain protons or hydrogen ions. Now, the most common hydrogen carrier is NAD. We saw it here. And we actually write it as NAD plus because this hydrogen carrier was reduced from this original reactant, which was NADH. And the way that we ended up with NADH was you took the NAD plus 2 hydrogen ions plus 2 electrons, and you ended with NADH. The less common hydrogen carrier is FAD or FAD, which is reduced to form FADH2. So you can take the FAD molecule and add 2 hydrogens and 2 electrons, and you end up with FADH2. So think of these carrier molecules or these hydrogen carriers or these electron carriers. Think of them as taxis. They're transporting electrons, and they can also transport hydrogen ions in the cristae of the mitochondria. Okay? All right. So moving forward. Let's look at the energy transfer here via the hydrogen carriers. So here we see oil rig again. Here we see reduction and oxidation reaction. So here we see an organic molecule, and this organic molecule, what is it going to do? As it gets broken down through an oxidation process, right? And let's remember our oil rig. Oxidation is to lose. This organic molecule is going to lose some of its hydrogens, and it's going to, or hydrogen ions, which are the same thing as protons, and is also going to lose some of the electrons. So when this organic molecule becomes oxidized, that means that it loses its protons or hydrogen ions, and it loses its electrons. So we call that oxidation. So then these hydrogen ions and these electrons get picked up by the carrier molecule. And here's where we see NAD+. That's a carrier molecule. So NAD+ is able to, as you can see here, carry the hydrogens, ions, and the electrons. So when NAD+ picks up those hydrogen ions and electrons, we say that NAD+ becomes reduced, right? We saw it over here. It becomes reduced to NADH, okay? And then it kind of releases a hydrogen ion here. But when NAD+ becomes reduced, that means that it gains energy, right? Because remember that this organic molecule, as it started to break down, right, in this oxidation process, it transferred its energy to these hydrogen ions and these electrons that now get picked up here by this molecule. Okay. Now, one last thing here is that this whole process requires oxygen to function. And that's why we call it aerobic respiration, right? And aerobic respiration is going to generate a lot of ATP versus anaerobic respiration from these hydrogen carriers. So in aerobic respiration, we're able to unlock more of the energy stored in organic molecules and produce more ATP. All right, so that was a lot. So make sure you go back and you review this material, and you also read the section that corresponds in your textbook.